Let me tell you something strange about people who don't talk too much. We live in a world where being heard is treated like proof of existence, where silence is often mistaken for absence. Yet some people move through conversations lightly, carefully, almost invisibly. They listen more than they speak. They pause where others rush. And here's the question that always lingers, quietly, uncomfortably. What's really happening inside them? It's easy to assume the answer is simple: shyness, insecurity, a lack of confidence. But that's not the full picture. Beneath the surface, there's an entire psychology at play. One that has very little to do with fear and much more to do with perception, boundaries, and how some minds experience the world. See, for some people, not talking much is not a social failure. It's a form of orientation, a way of standing slightly to the side of things in order to see them more clearly. They're the ones who notice shifts in tone before words change, who sense tension before it's named, who feel the emotional temperature of a room without needing it explained. While others speak to place themselves into the moment, these people observe to understand it. You might see them at a gathering, quiet, nodding, smiling gently, not competing for attention, not rushing to be interesting. And from the outside, it can look like disconnection, but internally, there's often a remarkable level of engagement. Their minds are active, layered, quietly alive. Psychologists sometimes describe this as a form of deep processing. Information doesn't just pass through them, it settles, it lingers, it connects to other memories, other meanings. Words are not thrown out casually, because words, to them, carry weight. And when everything feels meaningful, silence becomes a kind of respect. It's not that they have nothing to say, it's that they're choosing when it's worth saying. And that choice is often misunderstood. We live in a culture that rewards immediacy, quick responses, fast opinions, constant visibility. To speak quickly is to appear confident. To speak often is to seem engaged. So when someone doesn't do that, we reach for explanations that make us comfortable. They must be unsure, they must be withdrawn, they must be afraid. But maybe that's projection. Maybe it's discomfort with quiet mirrors. Because silence does something unsettling. It removes distraction. It invites awareness. And not everyone knows what to do when there's nothing filling the space. For people who don't talk much, silence isn't empty. It's organized. It's intentional. They're often regulating internally, monitoring energy, deciding where to place attention. In psychological terms, this is sometimes linked to an internal locus of control, the sense that your inner state matters more than external performance. Expression becomes a choice, not a reflex. And here's the paradox. The quieter someone is, the more others tend to speak around them, filling gaps, explaining themselves, revealing things they didn't plan to. Silence invites truth, often unintentionally. But that silence doesn't come from nowhere. For many people, it's shaped early, not through trauma necessarily. Sometimes through subtle environments, where being observant was safer than being expressive, where listening carefully mattered, where speaking impulsively carried consequences, emotional or social. Over time, the mind adapts. It learns restraint. It learns timing. It learns that presence doesn't always require volume. And eventually, that adaptation becomes identity. But here's what's often missed. This way of being isn't passive, it's highly attuned. Quiet people are often managing more than one layer of reality at once. The words being spoken, the emotions underneath, their own internal reactions, the unspoken social rules moving between everyone in the room. Talking less is sometimes the only way to stay coherent within all that information. Because when you feel deeply, you choose carefully. Of course, not all silence comes from the same place. And this is where the story becomes more complex. Some people don't talk much because they're at peace. Others don't talk much because they're protecting themselves. The behavior looks the same. The motivation is entirely different. For some, silence is freedom, a release from the pressure to perform. They've stepped outside the constant demand to be interesting, impressive, articulate. They've realized that not every thought needs an audience, that some experiences lose their meaning when they're explained too quickly. For others, silence is armor, a way to avoid being misunderstood or dismissed or exposed. Perhaps they learned early that speaking didn't lead to being met, that words were ignored or twisted or minimized. And so the nervous system adapted again, this time toward invisibility. And both truths deserve compassion, because here's the deeper psychological layer. Human beings don't just communicate to exchange information. We communicate to regulate connection, to feel safe, to feel seen. When that safety isn't guaranteed, expression becomes a risk calculation. So some people reduce the risk. They say less, they wait longer. They choose depth over frequency. In a way, they're practicing psychological ownership, deciding what parts of themselves are public and what parts remain protected. In a culture that encourages oversharing, this can look like distance, but often it's discernment, and culturally, this creates tension. Because let's be honest, most of our social systems are designed for extroverted expression. Meetings reward those who speak first. Social media amplifies those who post often. Confidence is confused with volume, presence with performance. So when someone opts out of that rhythm, even unconsciously, it disrupts expectations. It challenges the idea that value must be visible. And that can make people uneasy. But pause for a moment. When was the last time you felt truly understood by someone who barely spoke? Someone who listened so closely you felt yourself slow down. Someone whose few words carried more weight than an entire conversation. That experience isn't accidental. There's a philosophical undertone to this kind of quiet. Because choosing not to speak is also choosing not to constantly define yourself for others. It's resisting the pressure to turn identity into narrative, to flatten complexity into something easily digestible. In a world that says, "Tell us who you are," silence becomes a form of self-definition, a refusal to be simplified. And maybe that's why it feels lonely sometimes. Because invisibility has a cost. When you don't announce yourself, you're often overlooked. When you don't explain yourself, you're misunderstood. And even when silence is chosen, the human need for connection remains. This is the shadow side, the part we don't romanticize. Not talking much can mean being passed over, misread, left out of decisions. It can mean carrying rich inner worlds that no one asks about. Depth without an audience. And yet, there's also transformation here. Over time, people who live this way often develop a different relationship with meaning. They stop measuring life by reaction, by applause, by feedback loops. Instead, value becomes internal, subtle, self-referenced. Colors look richer. Time feels slower. Conversations, when they happen, feel fuller. And psychologically, this aligns with something fascinating. Research shows that people who are more reflective and less verbally dominant often experience greater emotional regulation and lower sensitivity to external validation. Their dopamine loops aren't driven by attention, but by coherence, by feeling aligned internally. In simpler terms, they don't need to be seen to feel real. And maybe that's what makes their presence so grounding. Because sometimes, when someone doesn't talk much, they create space for others to become more honest, less performative, more human. Their silence isn't absence, it's invitation. Of course, this doesn't mean quiet is always virtuous, or that speaking is shallow. That's not the point. The truth lives in the middle, as it often does. Some people speak to connect. Some people stay quiet to connect. The mistake is assuming one is deeper than the other. But if you've ever been someone who doesn't talk much, you've probably felt the tension of that misunderstanding. The pressure to explain yourself, to justify your quiet, to reassure others that you're okay, that you're engaged, that you belong. And maybe that's the quiet confidence that develops over time. Not the loud kind, not the performative kind, but the steady acceptance of your own rhythm. Maybe real confidence isn't about having something to say in every moment. Maybe it's about knowing you don't have to. There's something almost sacred about that restraint, about keeping parts of life unspoken, untranslated, not because they're secret, but because they're meaningful. Some moments lose their power when they're immediately shared. Some thoughts need silence to grow. Some truths arrive only when there's room for them. And maybe that's what people who don't talk much are protecting, not their voice, but their depth. So the next time you notice someone who's quiet in a loud world, maybe don't rush to fill the space, maybe don't label it, or fix it, or interpret it too quickly. Maybe just let it be. And if this reflection feels personal, if you recognize yourself in these spaces between words, you don't need to explain it either. You can leave a comment, or not. You can share this, or keep it to yourself. Your silence is valid too. Because in the end, not talking much doesn't mean you're empty. It often means you're full of observation, full of feeling, full of things that don't need to be said to be real. And maybe, just maybe, the people who don't talk too much are quietly reminding us of something we've forgotten. That we're not meant to be performances. We're meant to be present.